Hi everybody, Rob here from Price Studios, and in this video I'm just going to quickly work through basically a new version of a Christmas animation I did a few years ago, which was quite popular, and that was based on animating a sweet herb. But this time I'm going to do something very slightly different. So I'm still going to talk about basic things like align to spline and so on and so forth, but I'm going to use something different. So I'm going to start off by just changing my output settings. So I'm going to make this 1920 by 814, and I'm going to change my frame rate to 25 frames per second in my output. I'm also going to hit Control D just to do the same in my project settings, so 25 frames there. And I'll give myself, let's say, 8 seconds, so let's go for 200 frames. Okay, and I'll make my preview the full range of the timeline. So my output now is going to be, if I just change this, about this size. I'm not going to worry too much about that at the moment, so I have a bit more room to maneuver. Now I want to do a kind of a Christmas tree shaped thing. So the previous example I did was just kind of a central stalk and then a couple of branches, and then, you know, it kind of grew in place. This one is not going to be a solid tree. This one's going to be a Christmas tree kind of spiral, but it's going to be formed out of particles which will then kind of fall away, leaving it gone. And I might do some kind of snow falling around as well, and a very basic little scene. So to start with, I need a helix spline, which is going to be in the XZ. Now I'm going to start with a radius of, let's say, 200, that'll be fine, and start angle of 0. I'm going to make an end radius of probably getting on for 0. In fact, let's go for 0, and 720 isn't quite enough, so I'm just going to times that by, say, 3. So I have a few more rotations around that y-axis, and let's go for a height a little bit taller. And what I want, so if I go into a front view or a side view here, I don't want the external radius of each spiral to be in a straight line like this. I want it to be more of a kind of a bell curve, and to do that you just change the radial bias, so you can do that outwards or inwards. So I'm going to increase it just a little bit, so we have more of a gentle curve. Well, that's just a bit more pleasing to the eye. Okay, so this is going to be our kind of guide spline, and I'm going to use X particles for this. So I'm going to just load up a palette, and I'll just drag that into my window. Let's just bring that in, pop it down here. Okay, so that's probably fine there. So I'm going to add an X particle system, and from within that I'm going to choose, in the generators, I'm going to add an emitter. So we'll call this one tree sparks, and on that I want to add a Cinema 4D tag align to spline. So the spline that's going to be aligned to is the helix. I'm going to drag that in. I'm just going to go back to the X particle systems and turn off the icon in the viewport, just so it's not in our way so much. Go back to my emitter, and I'm going to change that to be a sphere. I don't want it to be anywhere near as big. I'm going to make that a 1 centimeter sphere. Now if we just press play, you can see nothing is happening at the moment, and that's fine, except our explosion of particles. So first of all, I'm going to change the position of this around my scene. So to do that, I'm going to go to my align to spline, and I'm going to go to, say, frame 10. Oh, it doesn't matter, quite early on, 9 or 10 is fine. And for the position, I'm just going to keyframe that at 0. I'm going to go forward to frame 100, and let's say about 120, and I'm going to increase this to 100, and I'll keyframe that again. So now my path, or my particle emitter, over the course of that, whatever, 110 frames, is going to whiz its way around that spline. The particles are going to look horribly messy because they're incredibly fast, but let's just check that motion. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Right, so let's fix the emission here. So let's go to emission, and we'll stick with birth rate of 1,000. Might even be a bit too many. Let's knock that down to 500 for now. And speed, I don't want them to be born and then just sit where they are. I want them to move out very slowly. So let's start with maybe 2 centimeters as a starting speed. I think they maybe need to be just a little bit more. So let's knock that up to, say, 6. Okay, now you can see there's one problem with this, and that's that we have a kind of an expanding sphere of particles right at the beginning, and that's because for these first 10 frames they're emitting in place because our align to spline doesn't actually start until frame 10. So what we need to do is just go back to our emitter, and we need to change the emission properties. So we don't want them to emit on all frames. So let's turn that off, and we'll change the start frame to 10 and the end frame to 120 to match the end frame of our align to spline. So now, there we go, and when we get to the top it should stop emitting, and it does, which is pretty cool. Now what I'd also like to happen, let's just go back up here to this frame. I think at this point we'll hold for maybe 10 frames, so just under half a second or so. I'd like them to start falling down, so the tree is kind of built, that shape is built out of the particles, and then at this point I want them all to, gravity to kick in and for them to drop. So let's go back to our system, and we'll use a motion modifier here, and I'm going to add a gravity, which is that one there. So let's go to our gravity, and first of all, we'll check our strength. Now that's going to be way too high. These are just going to drop down, as you can see, and it's quite a pleasing effect for some things, not what we need for this. So I'm going to drop this down to probably around, maybe even lower than this. Let's have a look. Yeah, we'll go lower. We'll go to, I'm just going to start with 5, so a very low gravity. Because we're not doing this for kind of physics reasons. We're doing this purely for just to kind of disintegrate our tree. So 5 is a bit too few, or a bit low. 10 might well do it, but maybe we'll try 20 and see how that looks. And I'm really just eyeballing this to see how it looks. Now I think they need to go a bit quicker again, so let's go back up to say 50. Great. Okay, so we need to just check our emission or our line to spline just to see where we're going to go. So we're going to go about 130 to 140 ish. I'm going to set this to say 139 is fine. So let's go back to our gravity, and we're going to just change. We need to change the enabled setting here. So there's no, so unlike the emission where you can change the emitter to work on certain frames, with the gravity we just need to turn it on and off. So I'm going to turn it off on this frame, keyframe that parameter. Let's move forward 1 frame, turn it on, keyframe that, and then we should find that our particles will emit all the way around. They'll stay roughly in place. I'm going to add a little bit of secondary motion to them in a minute. The emitter will get to the top. It will wait half a second or so, or almost a second, and then they'll all drop down. Okay, so let's have a look, see if that works. So spinning around just like I wanted, gets to the top, and then they all fall down. Now, they look a little bit too uniform there, so let's go back to our gravity, go to a point where gravity is actually working. Which will be here, and I'm going to change the variation here so they don't all drop at exactly the same speed, because that looks just a bit too uniform. So I'm going to go for kind of 25 there, and that will mean that there's a fairly good variation in the gravity, and they'll all fall at a slightly different speed, which I think just looks slightly nicer and a bit more organic. Okay, right, so let's add some secondary motion. So I'm going to go back to the the system, and in motion modifiers I'm going to add a new modifier, and I'm just going to go for some turbulence. Now I don't want this to be massive, I don't want it to have a huge effect, I just want it to have a small effect on the motion. See, that's going just crazy. So we can either change the strength here or we can change the scale. So let's change the scale down to about 10% and see if that gives us the look I'm after. So I think maybe somewhere between the two. I think maybe around 40, but we'll change the strength to 1. Still a little bit too much in the scale, I think. We'll go maybe 20. What I'm trying to do here is get it so that the particles move around a little bit, but they keep the overall shape of the tree. So I'm just going to drop that down again. I think even that might be just a bit too much. Let's reduce the strength to 0.5. Okay, so they're moving around a little bit. Still probably a bit too much. So I'm going to decrease the scale to, say, 4%. And I'm going to change the frequency down to about half as well. And I'm also going to change the strength to 0.2. So really very small effect on the particles, but enough to get them just moving almost like little fireflies. Okay, right, so I think probably the amount of particles is looking quite good at this point. What I want them also to do is I want them to have tiny little trails that will follow on. So as each one leaves the main starting point, their kind of spawn point, I want them to have a little trail. And to do that, I just need to make sure I've got my system selected, go to generator objects, and I want to choose trails. So let's start off just by seeing what the default setting does there. And you can see that's actually generating quite a nice little thing for us there, and it all drops away. So I think for the dropping away section, that's probably not what we want. I think the trails want to stop at about frame 120-ish, 125. So we can change. So at the moment the tails are lasting for the full scene. We don't want that. We want them to last probably up until let's say to 120. See how that looks. We're not going to worry about variation so much here. It's not such a problem. Freeze when complete, yes. We'll freeze the trail. Okay, so this will mean that all of this shaping will remain even though the particles will drop with gravity, as long as I've set that right. So the particle trails get to there. Okay, so we need to change our trail length just a little. Let's change that down to, say, 110, because I don't want the trails to be making this downward motion as the gravity kicks in. So they're growing the tree. Okay, that's still... let's go for length rather than time. So length needs to be, let's say, about 115. It needs to be under the length of our emission of those particles and before they start falling. So way less. Let's go for it. Actually, it doesn't even need to be that much at all. Let's try about 30. So we get just over a second's worth of animation on those trails. Almost. Not quite there yet, but we're getting there. So let's make this 15. Just push that back a little bit more. Right, a tiny touch more. Let's go back another 3 frames. Let's make it just around 10 frames with a 2 frame variation. So the maximum can be 12 and the minimum will be 8 frames worth of that animation. And that would just make them just very slightly different so that their endpoints will be slightly different. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to add a sweep spline. So let's just go into add a sweep and let's add a very, very small circle. And it doesn't need to be adaptive, it can be uniform, and we'll just give that a simple, so it's kind of pentagon shaped. Let's make this 1 centimeter. So we need to add our circle, which is our profile, to the sweep. We need to add our trail as the path, and that should, if we just zoom in, give us the geometry. Now, what I want to do here is I want to go to this sweep, and in the details tab, I just want to tail them off so they come to a point. So I'm just going to grab that last point there and just decrease that radius like so. Maybe rounder, maybe not quite so pointy, but certainly close. Lift that up. Okay, so now we have not quite needle shapes, but they're going to be kind of crystalline. So if I just zoom in here so you can see, I'll just run through the animation again. And you should see these spikes growing like so. That works pretty well, you can see them. And if we take another sweep, so I said the tree was going to disappear, but actually we're going to make a tree out of this at the same time. So we'll take another circle spline. This one can be maybe 1.5 centimeters. We'll make that a child, and we'll take our helix and drag that in to be our profile there. What we need to do is we want this to just follow the growth of those particles. So the particle emitter finishes at, what frame was it? 120. So we need this sweep to finish at 120. So at frame 10, we want it to be at 0. We want our growth to be at 0. So let's take our end of growth, make that 0, and we'll keyframe this, and then by frame 120 we want it to be at 100%, like so, and we'll keyframe that. And we're also just going to add another point to my details of this second sweep just by control clicking on the spline there. I'm just going to reduce the thickness just so we have a slightly more natural looking path here. So by the way, when I'm saying tree, I don't mean tree, I just mean this kind of stylized mesh that we've got going on. Okay, so let's back out just a little bit. We'll go back to the start, deselect everything so it's not getting in the way. I'm just going to press play and see what happens. So we have the particles, and they're being chased fairly rapidly by the profile of the or the path of the helix, and then as that grows, you can just see the individual kind of fronds growing from it as well. Now we're making a lot of geometry and particles, and I'm recording this screen, which is why this is starting to slow down a bit. Usually that wouldn't be a case. Xparticles is really responsive and fast. So if you're following along, you're probably seeing your results an awful lot quicker than I am. Now, once the tree has been built by this particle fairy thing, whatever it might be, that will remain. The particles will then fall away, leaving the geometry in place, which should happen in about 10 frames. You can just see it's getting to the top now. That cubic kind of the bounding box you can see there, that's just the kind of the overall size of what's going on in the scene. Okay, so now they're going to start falling away. The geometry is all built, so there's no animation going on there. And let's just bring it all back. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now I just need to start working on a little bit more detail. So I'm going to turn off the emitter for a minute. I'm going to go back to frame 0 just so I can see what it's doing. I'm going to turn off that sweep. Let's just call that trunk. And these ones are the fronds. I'll turn them off as well. I don't need to see those for a minute. Okay. What I'm not overly keen on at the moment is the fact that the helix is still really regular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a displace deformer and I'm going to make that a child of my helix. And inside this deformer, I'm just going to go into the shading tab and I'm going to add just a simple noise, and you can already see that started to do something. Now I'm going to change this to maybe a wavy turbulence, and I'm going to increase the scale. Let's start off with, so we're looking at about 500%. If I go into a view here, let's just see what that's doing. So I'm going to go back to that displacer, go back to the object, and I'm just going to use the height control here to control how much deformation happens. So at the moment it's only moving 10 centimeters, and even though the strength is 100%. So I'm going to increase this. Let's just type in 50 and see how extreme that is. Now that might be a little bit too much. So let's go back to say 30, and that's looking all right. Maybe a touch less. So let's go to 25. And there we go. So that's looking quite nice. It's given us a little bit more variation. We should find, let's turn on our emitter. Let's just go back to the start and see what this looks like. Okay, so that's cool. That's just a touch more organic. That's a word I use a lot, but it just means there's a bit of kind of random chaos. That's all I'm getting at. Okay, so far happy with that. What I need to do now is just build some simple materials and a little scene for us to actually use this animation in. So I'm not going to cover the building of that scene. I'm just going to use a very simple dish-shaped plane, stick some materials on it. I'll possibly use just a plain background and then a bit of depth of field, and I'll probably do just a simple camera move, but you don't need to see that. This video tutorial is really just about me documenting for you guys how I did my little Christmas card thing. So thanks very much, and I'll see you all in the next video.